Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council and the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. My name is Fred Hoff, and today marks my first week as director of the Rafiq Hariri Center. Today also marks the first of what I hope will be several Hariri Center programs focusing on the issue of civilian protection in the Middle East. We start today by taking a broad view in a discussion entitled Civilian Suffering in Arab Conflicts. And we start at the very top in terms of wisdom and expertise on this issue with Ken Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. What we're trying to get at today is more than an accurate description of civilian suffering in Middle East conflict scenarios. We'll get that for sure. But what has interested me for a long time is this traditional paradigm of foreign policy realism versus idealism. The long-standing question of whether there is a conflict and a contradiction between the pursuit of national interests and the protection of human beings from mass homicide campaigns conducted by their own governments, or from conventional military operations where civilians may not be deliberately targeted, but they nevertheless die in large numbers and suffer enormous material losses. Speaking personally, for most of my professional life, I located myself very firmly in the so-called realist camp. This began to change early in the century when I read Samantha Power's amazing book about America in the age of genocide. At this point in my professional life, frankly, I wonder if the paradigm itself has any meaning grounded in reality. An old friend of mine from exchange student days in high school, Professor Richard Betts of Columbia University, has written wisely and extensively on this issue. Elliot Cohen refers to the blending of values and interests in a very interesting op-ed in today's New York Times. I've written here at the Council about the impact of collective punishment and mass homicide in Syria on our allies and friends in the region and in Western Europe. One need not be motivated purely and exclusively by humanitarian instincts to appreciate, for example, the impact of the Assad regime's survival strategy and the support it has received from Russia and Iran to appreciate the connection between humanitarian abomination and national interest, including the impact on the domestic politics of both Western Europe and the United States. But my role today is not to expound on these issues, but to allow Ken Roth to say whatever it is he wants to say about them, to have a brief discussion with Ken when he's done, and then turn it over to you for your questions. I think most people in this room have some familiarity with the hard-hitting, take no prisoners, independent, and nonpartisan investigating and reporting of Human Rights Watch. This organization has been around since 1978. Its mission statement is straightforward. Quote, Human Rights Watch defends the rights of people worldwide. We scrupulously investigate abuses, expose the facts widely, and pressure those with power to respect rights and secure justice. Human Rights Watch is an independent international organization that works as part of a vibrant movement to uphold human dignity and advance the cause of human rights for all, unquote. Ken Roth is the executive director of Human Rights Watch. He's a graduate of Brown, Yale Law School, and before life at Human Rights Watch, he was an attorney, both in the private sector and as a federal prosecutor. He's widely published. He's known around the world as a champion of human rights. He's also given a great deal of thought to the question of the intersection between foreign policy in the traditional sense and civilian protection, and how human rights advocates should evaluate possibilities of military steps to protect human beings when all other possibilities have been exhausted. For those of you not in the audience physically, I'd invite you to join the conversation and submit questions via Twitter at AC Mideast, hashtag cost of conflict. That's at AC Mideast, hashtag cost of conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ken Roth.
Well, thank you, Fred, for setting up this daunting task. When Fred and I chatted in advance, and he told me, oh, no problem, I just want you to talk about civilian protection throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And they're going to then devote, entire series of lectures to this, but I'm supposed to just sum it up at the beginning. I said, thanks. But what I will do, I will go through, I will do a brief overview. Given the breadth of necessity, I won't be able to go in too much depth, but I'd at least like to sort of set the table with a series of thoughts about a number of the countries. And I'll try, Fred, to address your realism versus idealism dichotomy, because, to be honest, I think if you ask most people today, what is the aim of, say, U.S. policy in the Middle East, North Africa, they would say, well, it is idealism. It's to stop ISIS. ISIS is this terrible entity, or to stop al-Qaeda, or to stop, the slaughter in Syria. But then I think there is, all too often a tendency to resort to realist means to pursue that idealistic goal, and that doesn't work too well. And that I will try to demonstrate through a few examples and then open it up for conversation. Let me begin with Syria, just because that's, the country that has preoccupied me more than any other in the region for a number of years now. And I mean, this may be getting too basic, but I find that it's often bears repeating that what makes the Syrian conflict so completely awful is that this is not a war where soldiers are shooting at soldiers and that, sometimes incidentally civilians get in the way. This is a war where the Assad government has chosen to fight it by attacking civilians who live in areas held by the armed opposition. This is a war, deliberately fought by ripping up the Geneva Conventions and the basic concept behind international humanitarian law of civilian immunity from military attack. That's behind the barrel bombing of hospitals and markets and refugee camps. That's behind the sieges, not just of military forces, but of entire civilian communities. That's behind the awful treatment of prisoners. And frankly, that's the reason why we have such a huge refugee crisis. Because, you can't, like a traditional conflict, move a bit away from the front lines and figure that you'll be safe enough, you can keep your family in the country. When Assad is deliberately attacking you any place in opposition-held areas, there's no safe place to go. And so, millions, 4.5 million, have fled the country. And millions more have been internally displaced to, often to government-held parts of the country. So, when you present this dilemma to the U.S. government, when you ask John Kerry, what are we doing about this war crime strategy of fighting this war? His answer is, well, we're going to make peace. We're going to stop the fighting, and then the atrocities will end. And there's obviously a certain internal logic to that. But the difficulty is when you start looking at the fine print. The terms on which everybody agrees, if there's going to be a negotiated end to the conflict, the terms on which it will end, involved a managed transition for the Assad government. Nobody wants an abrupt transition which could replicate, the Iraq situation where you had a collapsed government and chaos. I think at this point it's broadly understood that chaos is perhaps even worse than what we have now. And so the idea is to keep state structures intact, but to transition the government, and to do it in a way that doesn't provoke panic. Now, the debate right now is how long would that transition take place? You know, Assad says it'll be an endless transition where, you know, the opposition can join me for a while. You know, others are looking for a 6-month transition. You know, maybe they'll compromise and have an 18-month transition. But the idea is that, you know, for some hopefully modest period of time, Assad would retain power, and the opposition is being asked to sign off on that. It's safe to say that the opposition is never going to agree to a role for Assad so long as Assad is barrel bombing their family and friends and neighbors. And so not an end result of the peace negotiations, but a prerequisite to the peace negotiations, in my view, is an end to these government-sponsored atrocities. And this is where I think there's been a real gap in Kerry's approach to this. Because Kerry is not devoting significant pressure to ending the atrocities. And the reason is that the only real route we have, the only source of leverage over Assad is Moscow. What we've seen over the last year, really since September 30th, is that Iran's support for the Assad government is not enough to stave off, if not collapse, at least very significant defeats. That Russia is a critical military partner for the survival of the Assad government. And that gives Putin leverage. But Kerry has been unwilling to use that leverage in an aggressive way, because Putin's view of Russia is, you know, they are now a partner in this peace process. And he has not been willing to treat them, where appropriate, as also an accomplice in war crimes, an accomplice in mass murder. There has been no public strategy aiming at Russia's role in allowing Assad's atrocities to continue. And in fact, it's been almost worse. Occasionally, you know, the Russians will sign up to some anodyne statement. The UN Security Council put out a press statement last week, which said all the right things, you know, no indiscriminate warfare, et cetera, which is, you know, completely violated the next minute by Assad. But it gives Russia the opportunity to pretend that they're on the right side, but there's no real leverage, no real pressure put on them to use their leverage to stop Assad's atrocities. So I think that the only way to set the preconditions, to kind of create an environment where the difficult political compromises that will be needed can be made to secure a peace accord, is by pressuring Russia to stop Assad's atrocities. And Russia is pressurable because Russia cares about its reputation, not necessarily in the United States, but in Europe. You know, Russia wants a divided Europe to get the Ukraine sanctions lifted, to increase its, you know, relative power vis-a-vis the European Union. It puts enormous resources and effort into public diplomacy in Europe. And the US is kind of not answering back. It's not making Russia stop being at least a passive accomplice in mass murder in Syria as the price to be paid for securing a reasonable reputation in Europe. And this is, I think, just a, you know, a major shortcoming in the US government's approach to the Syrian problem. I don't see the conditions being set in Syria for the compromise being necessary until that pressure is put on Assad, on Russia, to stop Assad's barrel bombing, to stop the sieges, to open up the prisons. You know, what makes things even more complicated is that, you know, the US has an incoherent military strategy in Syria. And here I'm going to say this sort of not as a Human Rights Watch advocate, because we actually don't take a position on military intervention in Syria. But, you know, suffice it to say that the US approach has basically had two parts, both focused on ISIS alone. You know, one is to work through the Syrian Kurds, the PYD, but that has real limits to it. It's been very successful in kind of creating a, you know, a path along the northern Syrian, southern Turkish border. But even there, we're bumping up into Erdogan's determination not to allow the Rojava, the two parts of Syrian Kurdistan to link up. I mean, that's a lot of why Erdogan these days is pushing for this concept of a safe zone that just coincidentally happens to be in the part that the Kurds don't control in northern Syria. Of course, it wouldn't be at all safe because nobody's proposing to control it, but it's his way of saying, don't let the Kurds hook up there. We're going to kind of keep that as somehow sacred or Turkish-controlled territory. So, this safe zone that is not safe is one ploy that Erdogan is putting on to limit the possibility of using the Kurds to push up against ISIS. And of course, the Kurds have real ethnic limits in how far south they can move, given the lack of a Kurdish population in most of the ISIS heartland. The other part of the U.S. military strategy is to create basically an FSA Syrian government coalition against ISIS. But that, again, is premised on working for a significant period with Assad, while Assad is killing far more civilians than ISIS. So, there is not a coherence to the U.S. military strategy. There's not really a strategy. And there's not a political strategy that is likely to work unless it changes to include a significant Russian dimension. Let me just, as a brief aside, I mean, we're talking really about the Middle East here, but I can't talk about civilian protection without mentioning the refugees for a moment. And it is, obviously from a U.S. government perspective, we've been completely stingy with respect to the refugees. Promising 10,000, delivering not even 2,000. This, in comparison to Germany, which took in most of the million that came to Europe over 2015, Germany still seems willing to be taking, say 500,000 a year. I mean, those are big numbers for a country that has a population of, 80 million, compared to these tiny, tiny numbers that the U.S. is contemplating. One, real difficulty of the current EU-Turkey deal is that it has silenced the EU toward Erdogan's serious backsliding on rights. And this is an area where the U.S. could be really kind of picking up the ball, in that there is a very deliberate undermining of the checks and balances on Turkish democracy. There's been obviously this revival of the war in the southeast against the PKK. Very difficult to get information on what's going on there, but significant indications that this is being fought much more as an urban war than the last time, and with much greater devastation to the cities as a result. Certainly the U.S. should be pushing the idea that there is no safe zone in Syria, that's utter fiction. It should also be challenging the European Union's view that Turkey is a safe third country, so that asylum seekers arriving in Greece can be summarily sent back on the theory that they should have applied for asylum there, even though Turkey has ratified the Refugee Convention in a way that only applies to Europeans, not to any of the Syrians or the Iraqis or Afghans who are passing through in need of protection. So there's a lot that can be done with respect to the refugee crisis that the U.S. is not actively doing right now, but I realize that that's a bit afield from our topic, so I'm not going to say much beyond that. I'm happy to get into it in more detail, though, during Q&A later. Let me, though, move next door to Iraq. In Iraq, I have to say that, unlike in Syria, in Iraq, the U.S. Does have a military strategy. And it's, the strategy is basically to build up the Iraqi armed forces as a multi-sectarian force, to diminish the role of the Shia militias, which are as much contributing as to the problem as solving it. And then to bring in U.S. military force to add that, provide that added clout over the supposedly reconstituted Iraqi security forces. Just by way of background, and I suspect I'm treading over territory that you all are familiar with, but the reason downgrading the Shia militia matters so much is because they are a lot of why we had that sudden growth in the territory that ISIS controlled in Iraq. If you go back and look at ISIS's predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it essentially lost. It was largely expelled at a point where through the awakening councils, the Sunni tribes felt that they had a place in Iraq. Not a place in Saddam's Iraq, a place in still Shia-dominated Iraq, but nonetheless a place of some security. Under former Prime Minister Maliki, who seems, I mean, I'm just psychoanalyzing, but seemed to be a very paranoid man, not to trust the Iraqi security forces. He seemed to feel more comfortable with the Shia militia. And so he oversaw this expansion of Shia militia, which operated in an extraordinarily sectarian way, picking up young Sunni men, disappearing them, executing them, and leading the Sunni tribes to feel that they were actually safer under ISIS than they were under Baghdad. And suddenly, instead of these Sunni tribes being part of the solution to ridding Iraq of the extremists, they at least closed their eyes and allowed ISIS to come back in. That suggests that the answer to the problem is to again enable Sunnis to feel safe in Iraq. And the U.S. government gets this. I mean, the formal policy has been to downplay the Shia militia, to try to downplay the sectarianism, to create a safe place for all Iraqis. And the U.S. engineered the replacement of Maliki by Abadi, who also completely gets this, who seems a very decent man. The problem is he's not in charge. He's very much limited by Iran's ongoing presence, by the fact that Shia militia have not gone away. Maliki hasn't even gone away. And so he is trying to build up the Iraqi security forces. The U.S., if you look at how they've operated militarily, at first they seem to be much more careful about trying to work only with the Iraqi security forces, not with the Shia militia. You saw this around Ramadi and the retaking of that city, where it's not like the Shia militia were not there, but they weren't in the lead. And the U.S. was trying to not provide close air support to those militias. There seems over the last year to be much less attention to that, and the priority of just getting whoever is there to fight ISIS and ultimately to take Mosul seems to have now taken priority over this effort to downplay the Shia militia. And I'm afraid that is very short-sighted. Now, it's not as if the U.S. is banking entirely on the Shia militia. There's actually been a rise in Sunni militia. Of course, the U.S. is investing in the Peshmerga. But this, as you talk with officials, this is less at the fore. And I'm not convinced that it's happening through quiet diplomacy either. And so, what I worry about is, one, that we're not doing any favors, the U.S. government, to a body who I do think wanted to reintroduce the idea of a multi-confessional, multi-sectarian Iraq, but also that we are, by in a sense, downplaying the danger of sectarianism, we are laying a very unstable foundation for Iraq's future, and I'm not convinced it's going to work, and so that I think to view this as simply a matter of amassing troops to retake Mosul, rather than creating conditions where all Iraqis feel safe, is not the way that you're going to have a long-term solution to the ISIS problem. Let me go a bit south to Yemen. And here, with active U.S. support, with U.S. weapons, with U.S. intelligence, with U.S. refueling, the Saudi government has been responsible for an enormously large number of civilian casualties. The UN estimates that some 60% of the civilian casualties are due to this Saudi-led coalition. Roughly half of the overall casualties are civilian. This by an air force that has, the best technologically guided weapons that money can buy. This is not a second-rate military. This is, while they have been using cluster bombs, which they should not be using at all, they also, completely have precision-guided weapons and should be capable of hitting a military target. But instead, we've seen, attacks on markets, on refugee camps, on civilian factories, and in many of these cases, Human Rights Watch has been able to operate on the ground, go to the site of the attack, and figure out, was there a military target any place in the vicinity? And far too often the answer is no. And even if, arguably there may have been a few, Houthi fighters in the market, the Saudis seem to be leading this effort without any sense of proportionality, without any kind of real profound concern, legally required concern, to spare civilian life. And why is this? At times the Saudis seem to have been articulating this view that, that Houthi-controlled areas are free fire zones. They realized that that was getting them into legal problems. They backed off that. But they still seems to be this view that, Houthi civilians are somehow all backing the Houthi forces, and there's this real kind of dropping of the mandated distinction between fighter and non-combatant. The Brigadier General, the Saudi spokesman, who was, I guess, earlier this week on NPR, kind of epitomizes the attitude of the Saudis. He was talking about the Human Rights Watch reporting, saying, you don't even have anybody on the ground. So we actually had to send him a video of our researcher on the ground, standing at the market. They've just been hit. But there is just this refusal to treat this issue seriously. The U.S. government says, oh, we're working on this. We're trying to give them more precision weapons. We're, working with them with better intelligence. But, there seems to be this basic problem at the top of not taking seriously the duty to target, precisely only military targets and to genuinely spare civilians. And this is an issue where, because of the broader charm offensive going on right now between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, trying to placate the Saudis over their discontent with the Iranian nuclear deal, the U.S. is just not making a priority of these issues and is not out there in any kind of public way pushing to downplay or to curtail these civilian casualties in a way that it should. I realize I don't want to go on too long here. Let me touch briefly on Libya. And here again, the top U.S. priority is trying to curtail and ultimately reverse the at this point growing ISIS beachhead in Libya. And the strategy has been to bank on the creation of a government of national accord, the kind of the current incarnation of what is supposed to be, a gradual reunified Libya. The problem is that this is largely a fictional entity, and Libya is still essentially a collection of militia. And many of these militia have fairly rotten, shall we say, human rights records. And again, the U.S. seems to be prioritizing, the question of just getting more militia on our side, rather than really kind of heavily vetting and insisting on compliance with humanitarian law as a condition for joining some kind of coalition, receiving any exemption to the arms embargo that might be instated. There's, and in many ways it's kind of a similar problem to what we're seeing in Syria, that, the issue of, getting allied troops has become much more of a priority than the way those troops behave. But again, this is not exactly the way of trying to build a Libya where various tribes and various forces can feel that they have a safe, comfortable role. Let me just touch quickly on two other situations, Egypt and Israel, and then open it up to conversation. On Egypt, let me make just three quick points there. One is that, obviously Egypt is a massive beneficiary of U.S. military assistance. The U.S. has no idea how its weapons are being deployed in the Sinai. It doesn't even have people on the ground. It is just operating in the dark. And given what we know about the way Egyptian security forces operate, there's every reason to believe that those operations are indiscriminate, that torture is being used, that people are being wrongfully targeted. And there is, I think at this point, no guarantee that the United States is not complicit in those abuses through its active arms support and military supplies. Second, if you look at the broader effort to diminish the appeal of ISIS, Sisi is a gift to ISIS. What Sisi represents is a closing the door to the possibility of electoral political Islam. And if you're ISIS, that's like golden, because ISIS wants this dichotomy. Either you got the autocrat or you've got us, the jihadist. And what the Muslim Brotherhood represented was a middle ground. And there are plenty of problems with the Morsi government. There are plenty of imperfections of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they nonetheless represented electoral political Islam. And for them to become anathema, for Sisi to have just snuffed them out, put tens of thousands in prison, closed the door, not just to political Islam at this stage, but really to any form of opposition, closing human rights groups, civil society, completely taming the press. He is, creating the kind of dichotomized universe which ISIS loves. And this is the U.S. ally. Now, the U.S., I think, is putting up with him on the theory that, like, this is an oasis of stability. It's not Syria. We got bigger things to worry about. But it is, first of all, I think it's probably very short-term stability. But it also, I think the U.S. is ignoring the consequence for the rest of the world, the possibility of, what do those who want a government that in some sense is guided by Islam but would like democracy, what does Egypt say to them about the prospects of that? And, Kerry has done us no favors at all. It's almost as if he's incapable of visiting Egypt without the words, transition to democracy blurting out of his lips. Even though, nobody pretends there's a transition to democracy underway in Egypt. Things are actually getting worse, further from democracy than not. And Kerry has, just refused in any serious way to recognize that. He seems to almost be an apologist for what's going on. The quest to remove human rights conditions from U.S. military assistance sends, a completely counterproductive message. It's as if all that the U.S. government cares about is that you're friendly toward the U.S. government, not how you treat your people, not how you fight wars. And so, this is the opposite of the message that the U.S. government should be sending if it really cared about civilian protection. Final point I will make is with respect to Israel. I'm not going to dwell on the Gaza conflict of a couple years ago, other than to say that the International Criminal Court is actively examining this. There are big issues to examine. Hamas's indiscriminate rocket attacks into southern Israel, for one. Israel's decision, I can name various, but to target the family homes of Hamas fighters. Can you imagine if Hamas was going to, Tel Aviv and blowing up the houses of IDF soldiers, getting their family? I don't know what the legal theory is there, but there are serious issues for the ICC to be looking at, and Human Rights Watch is working with them. I'd like to, though, here focus on the West Bank. And I think it's time to stop looking at the West Bank simply as an occupation. It obviously is an occupation, and the law of occupation, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, continue to have important relevance. They are what makes the settlements illegal. They are what makes Israel exploitation of resources of the West Bank, the quarries and the like, for Israeli benefit rather than for Palestinian benefit. It's what makes that illegal. Again, the ICC is actively examining these issues. But the reason I say that it's not enough to look at the West Bank as an occupation is because this occupation is almost 50 years old. It is no longer in any sense temporary. The law of occupation, I think, presumed a shorter period of control. And so I think it's necessary to start looking at the West Bank through the lens of international human rights law as well. And this is, not taking a position on what, is the two-state solution dead? Should it just be one territory now, one state? You can argue those back and forth. But regardless of how you end up there, it's time to start recognizing that Palestinians are living under an authority that should be respecting their human rights too. And the one I want to focus on here is the right not to be discriminated against. And if you look at Area C, the 60% of the West Bank where all of the settlements are, Palestinians face day-to-day discrimination. They don't get authorization to expand their houses. They don't get authorization to farm their fields, to start businesses, to do anything that requires governmental authorization is routinely denied, except in an occasional exceptional case. And it's almost as if the goal of Israel is to render life so inhospitable in Area C that gradually the Palestinians wither away. Now, the U.S. has, needless to say, not been helpful in countering this very deliberate Israeli approach to Area C. It has vetoed Security Council resolutions addressing the settlements or Area C. It actively pressured the Palestinians unsuccessfully not to join the International Criminal Court. It basically treats civilian protection as an afterthought of the peace process. But it's safe to say at this point, what peace process? You know, when you have a peace process that is going nowhere for 50 years, it's time to come up with a better strategy. And so by all means, talk peace if there's anything to talk about, but don't pretend that that's a sufficient solution to the plight of the Palestinian civilian population. And so, you know, there are some modest indications that the Obama administration may be open to reconsidering parts of this. They obviously were on their best behavior toward Israel during the Iranian nuclear negotiations and went out of their way to not raise these difficult issues. But since then, there have been, you know, little inklings of a reexamination. The Customs Service issued a reminder that it is wrong to label goods made in the settlements as if they are made in Israel. You know, which is obvious, but is not the kind of thing the U.S. government goes out of its way to remind us of, even though this was a 1995 regulation. But this reminder just came out a few months ago, and was clearly, you know, a very deliberate effort to try to, you know, stem some of this gradual incorporation of Area C into Israel. You know, Congress, as part of the effort to fight the BDS movement, passed legislation which also treated the settlements the same as Israel. And Obama, in his signing statement, said they're not Israel. Settlements are not Israel. You know, again, a very kind of clear statement trying to distinguish himself from the Netanyahu agenda. So, you know, these are small steps, but there's some opening. If the Obama administration is going to be serious, it'll start taking some additional steps. And you know, I would focus on the settlements as the area where I think there's the broadest unanimity about the wrongfulness of the Israeli approach. You know, don't veto UN Security Council resolutions on the settlements. That'd be a simple thing. Or another thing would be, you know, these days when the U.S., I mean, frankly, for decades, when the U.S. talks about the settlements, they talk to them about them as, you know, obstacles to peace. But they also are illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits the transfer of population to occupied territory. And the official U.S. government position, never repudiated, you know, adopted under Carter, is that these are violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The whole world thinks this, other than Israel. That's the official Red Cross position. The U.S. just doesn't repeat it. They only use the obstacle to peace language, not the these are illegal language. Obama could go back to the illegality, could stress the reality here. So these are, you know, examples of what, if this is the beginning of a repudiation of the Netanyahu approach to the West Bank, these are logical next things to do. So let me just sum up by saying that, you know, defeating ISIS is important. Defeating Al-Qaeda is important. Nobody really quarrels with that. But it is short-sighted to use means to embrace allies in this effort that themselves are as abusive as some of these allies are. Or to even close your eyes and just somebody like Assad, who you wouldn't call an ally, but who is not in any sense actively being pressured to stop his method of warfare. This, you know, unwillingness to take abusive methods of combat or abusive methods of government seriously reduces the U.S. presence in that region, in the Middle East, to one of military power. You know, there's no question that the U.S., if it wants to apply military power, still has overwhelming capacity. But I think we've learned from the Iraq War that you don't get much done through pure military means. And this was, you know, one of the early insights of Obama that has, you know, guided an important part of his approach to the region. But so if you know, nobody is urging massive military involvement, what's left? You know, well, what's left is to, you know, to be promoting an attractive political agenda, to stand for something, to have values that appeal to the people of the region that they can rally behind. And that's not what the US government is doing today. The US government, working through proxies, is still largely using a military-only means. There are bits and pieces of rhetoric and bits and pieces of policy that suggest the recognition that I'm sure exists behind the scenes that a military approach alone is insufficient. But that insight is not informing policy as it actually plays out. And as it plays out, it looks basically as if it's a one-dimensional military-only strategy. That's not going to work. We know it's not going to work. And we should admit that and find a way to come back to Fred's opening, to cut through this dichotomy between realism and idealism and realize that a realistic approach to this problem, a realistic approach to the region, is going to require attention to the very basic values of human rights that should help to bridge this false dichotomy. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Ken, that was a terrific overview. Thank you very, very much, and I'm sure you've inspired a lot of questions in the group here. I'm going to get things rolling though, and this may put you in a slightly difficult position, but I've literally been there myself. In fact, I'm going to ask you to trade places with me, figuratively speaking. My wife and I have a little place upstate New York, a couple hours north of the city. And there is a bar in Crumville, New York, the hub of the universe, where I hold forth now and then, and my Catskill friends and neighbors ask me some tough questions. These are folks who are relatively well educated about what's going on in the world. They see what's happened in Paris, in Brussels. They fear that something similar may happen in the United States. They're listening to a political debate in our country where subjects of torture, carpet bombing, targeting the families of terrorists in some cases may be necessary. And I must say that there is a baseline of sympathy to this point of view. So put yourself in the country in Crumville, New York, speaking with some good, solid, patriotic Americans. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, I mean, obviously you can answer it's wrong because it's immoral, but I know that that's not your question. Your question is, why is that not a pragmatic solution to the world's problems? And, the carpet bomb, the torture thing, all of this is actually, premised on this view that the U.S. is omnipotent, and it can get away with breaking the rules, because they'll never do that to us. And that, we should have learned, is not today's world. The U.S. is not omnipotent. The U.S. benefits from a rule-based global system. And if the U.S. undermines those rules, they will be decimated. That's why the U.S., the torture matters so much. I mean, that's why, frankly, I'm so upset that Obama, he stopped the torture, but he hasn't prosecuted the torturers. And that, enables people on the campaign trail to run around and treat torture as a policy option, because Obama hasn't taken it off the table by saying this is criminality. So we do have Obama to thank for the rhetoric today. But it is, it is in the interest of Americans to have a strong norm against targeting civilians, against severely mistreating civilians. And that is, if that norm is in place, meaning if the U.S. actively respects it, it makes it harder for the ISISes of the world to attract people to the alternative approach, which is targeting civilians. You never will eliminate the terrorist threat, but you want to eliminate the argument that this is a legitimate way to fight. This is a legitimate form of asymmetric warfare. And that's why, I just think that we are way past the point where the United States can feel comfortable as, capable of breaking the rules because nobody else can do anything to us anyway. we're just not in that world right now. And it is in Americans' interest to reinforce those rules, not to actively undermine them.
So potential blowback on us.
Yes. I mean, that's the pragmatic answer.
Yeah.
If you're not satisfied by saying it's
I'm
just wrong,
trying to deal with the folks in
Yeah.
Crumville.
Yeah.
And
I mean, look. I mean, Crumville is. If you're going to carpet bomb them, then it's okay to set off bombs in Crumville, or New York City, or whatever, Washington. I mean, what's the principle that says it's okay to indiscriminately bomb them, but it's not okay to indiscriminately bomb us? I mean, just at that simple level.
when you when you look at the situation in Syria, and all of the policy dilemmas presented by what I think you accurately described as a very deliberate political survival strategy of mass homicide. Can you tell us? Can you share with us a little bit about how in your business, with fellow human rights advocates, people who have really made this their lives work, what is the nature of the debate, the discussion back and forth about the utility, the morality, the feasibility of some kind of military intervention to protect civilians? What's sort of the yin and yang of this debate?
Well, I can tell you the debate, but this was a debate that was never conclusively resolved, which is why I opened up by saying, Human Rights Watch does not take a position on the use of military force in Syria. But we theoretically can advocate military force if it's the last feasible option to avoid mass slaughter, and if it's reasonably calculated to do more good than harm. I mean, that in essence is our test. And we had a very vigorous debate before the Russian intervention. I think actually the Russian intervention changes the calculus. But what the debate was about is, would there have been a way to stop the barrel bombing of civilians? And would it have been possible to have a military intervention that would have imposed certain consequences on Assad, destroying his aircraft or what have you, if that barrel bombing continued? And the barrel bombs were a big part of why civilians were dying. So that was the obvious attractiveness of that. The difficulty was it was just hard to see how that would play out. Would that lead to a gradual escalation, with unforeseen consequences? Could it lead to the toppling of the regime, which would also have, Iraq-like consequences? And it was that difficulty of sort of predicting the imponderables about the use of military force that led to hesitation, which is why we never stepped in. It obviously has changed that much more with Russia because nobody's going to advocate the U.S. and Russia fighting it out, which is why at this stage I feel that the most viable strategy, as I said, is one using public pressure on Moscow to in turn pressure Assad. I think at this stage there's not a realistic military strategy that's even being discussed with respect to Assad, unless somehow the Russians and Americans were to join together. But that doesn't seem very likely.
Not likely. Back in, if you think back to August, September 2013, in the aftermath of the big chemical atrocity and the whole Red Line controversy, what is there a way you could characterize your thinking of colleagues, Human Rights Watch, back in that context about the possibility of the United States reaching out and smacking the regime somehow?
See, I mean, at that point, Obama gets a lot of flack for this, but you could argue that perhaps through a bit of a ham-fisted approach, he got what he wanted to get. He did largely take chemical weapons off the table there, and so he could have declared victory. Now, obviously, this was an opportunity to hit Assad, and so the people who criticize Obama are ones who say he missed this opportunity. He could have destroyed the Air Force, and that would have made it harder for the barrel bombs to continue. But that's kind of a backhanded route into the barrel bomb discussion that we just had.
Yeah. When we hear Western politicians, in particular, use the phrase "never again," in their speeches. What they seem to be referring to quite specifically is that subset of mass homicide, which is genocide.
Or
Do
mass
you-
slaughter. Yeah, I mean,
That's what I want to get at. Your thinking about never again as a general sort of moral or political imperative. Where is it, in your view, where is it applicable?
well, I mean, first of all, Stalin's contribution to the Genocide Convention was to exclude political slaughter. So it's genocide if it's killing on the basis of ethnicity, race, religion, nationality, not political view.
Okay.
And so now, is there any moral distinction between slaughtering people because they happen to be your political opponents versus slaughtering them because they speak the wrong language or the wrong ethnicity? No. So, from a human rights perspective, the Genocide Convention is just, a bit too narrow. And so I don't make a personal distinction. If people are being slaughtered on political grounds in sufficient numbers, that's a never again situation too. Now, then the question comes up, well, never again, what does that mean? What do you do to prevent it? Mm-hmm. And you then get into the usual debate about, responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention, which requires, looking at reasonable likelihood of doing more benefit than harm, last feasible option to use military force. I mean, the usual factors.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned responsibility to protect, and that's another catchphrase. And it appears that the way that concept has evolved, there's the ultimate authority is vested in the international community, as expressed by the Security Council. Our ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, has remarked several times about the failure of the Security Council to protect civilians in Syria and elsewhere, the failure to implement this responsibility to protect. Are we left essentially, do you think, with a situation where any one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council can just block this? Is there, in your view, a responsibility to protect that would apply, for example, to the United States government, independent of the deliberations and decisions of the UN Security Council?
Yeah. I mean, first I should say that, R2P, the responsibility to protect, has become a bit of a dirty word because of the Libya intervention. Because, the perception by much of the world is that while, perhaps you could have justified military intervention to stop the imminent Benghazi slaughter, that, however you come out on that question, NATO then went further. And it became a regime change operation, not a civilian protection operation. So, NATO took this, exploited this opportunity provided by this R2P situation and went further. And therefore, there's a lot of distrust about R2P in much of the world. But Fred, to answer your question more directly, I don't think you can come up with any credible moral argument that insists on the Security Council being the sole arbiter of when we act on never again or not. Because that would mean that as long as the slaughter is done by a friend of one of the P5 or the P5 themselves, there's no action. And that's that may be the political compromise required to create the Security Council, but from a moral perspective, you can't stop there. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Human Rights Watch's policy on this deliberately doesn't require Security Council sign-off.
Okay.
We prefer it. We certainly prefer something more than one country acting, because if you have more of a coalition, more multilateral conduct, yes, you have a better chance of avoiding a pretext, and ensuring that action is really humanitarian rather than self-serving. But I don't think the right thing to do is to insist on Security Council sign-off, because that exempts many situations where you could have mass slaughter, but one of the P5 is going to protect the killer.
Sure. Finally, and I'll stop with this one. You in your remarks, you devoted some quality time to some of the activities and behaviors of friends and allies of the United States of America. In your discussions with U.S. officials about these matters, I'm sure I'm sure you get some pushback along the lines of yes, there is some regrettable behavior here, but you know, here are our policy options. We need Egypt for this. We need Saudi Arabia for that. Have you given any thought yourself? You know, instead of putting yourself in a bar in Crumville, you know, put yourself in a senior position in the U.S. State Department. What in your sense, in your imagination, what could it mean for the United States to take significant action on some of these issues? What can you see U.S. officials doing? What can you see the President of the United States deciding in one or two of these specific instances?
I mean, look, at the simplest thing is at the rhetorical level. I mean, you know, take Egypt. Why does John Kerry have to keep pretending it's a transition to democracy? You know, why can't we be tougher and say, you know, Sisi is a disaster for the future of Egypt? You know, press him to not crack down on civil society, to release the human rights activists, to allow the Muslim Brotherhood to exist as a political party. I mean, what do you lose in that process? You know, where is Sisi going to go? So it's just the U.S. could be doing so much more without losing Egypt, you know, or take the Saudis. I mean, I actually think that, and the Saudis know this, there is a much more natural alignment between the American people and the Iranian people than there is between the American people and the Saudi people. And you know, the Iranian leadership at the moment is particularly unenlightened. I don't mean the Rouhani Zarif crowd, but you know, Khamenei, but the hardliners in Iran may not be there forever. You know, I don't know how old Khamenei is. He's in his 70s. You know, the Expedience Council at this point is run by Rafsanjani, a relative moderate. You know, he could name himself. He could name somebody else like him as the next supreme leader. You know, Iran in 10 years could look very different. In fact, that's a lot of the bet underlying the nuclear deal. You know, kick it down the road for 15 years and it'll be a lot better, hopefully. The Saudis know that with a slightly different configuration at the top, the U.S. could very much align with Iran. And where are the Saudis going to go? You know, so why is the U.S. not being tougher with the Saudis, certainly with the way they're conducting themselves with Yemen, the way they're treating women, the way they're treating civil society? You know, and it's, I think there's an extreme caution in the White House and the State Department that is not required when you take a step back and look at the situation.
Okay, I would guess and I'll open it up for questions now. My only sort of gratuitous comment on this is I think, just based on my own experience, to be really effective in sensitive, debatable situations like this, you've got to start off with relationships of trust and confidence with the people you're dealing with. Without that, you get nowhere in these discussions, and I think this may be something that's lacking under current situation, under the current situation we face.
Yeah, I mean, Obama has not made a lot of effort to build rapport, let alone with senators, not to mention people, other parts of the world. But obviously, there's a whole State Department out there. There are lots of people who can build those relationships.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying gratuitously blow up relationships, but you can be more principled. And if you put the premium on getting along rather than standing for anything, that's not a good U.S. policy.
Quite right. Okay, let's open it up for questions. We will have a roving microphone here. What I would ask is that you please identify yourself, be brief, and end up with a question mark, if at all possible. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you both. Mr. Roth, it's a pleasure to hear you. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. As some of the people in the room know, yesterday the High Commissioner for Human Rights was here at the Brookings and had some things to say. So my question to you is as a general one, but germane to every single thing you've said. How well or how not well is that office doing? What could it do better? And given their tiny budget, which the High Commissioner kept stressing, what can we reasonably expect of them in terms of problems that are huge, a Security Council that faces the obstacles we've just discussed, but yet the hope of many as kind of an ultimate go-to entity, which often fails?
Well, I mean, I'm a great fan of Zaid. He's a friend, and I think he's, you know, incredibly dedicated, principled, smart, strategic, articulate. I mean, he's a great guy. He's, you know, he's presiding over a very difficult bureaucracy, filled with people who are not always putting the promotion of human rights as their priority. And it's very difficult to fire people in the UN. It's very difficult to kind of rearrange things. I know he always complains about his budget, but his budget is significantly larger than Human Rights Watch's budget. You know, so you know, if properly deployed, you can get a lot done. He doesn't have the capacity to deploy those resources in the ideal way. He's become, I think he's been very good at using his voice. The other, you know, there are other things he can do. He could be, I think, much more active than he has been, or than Ban Ki-moon has been, about putting things on the Security Council agenda. There's something under the UN Charter, Article 99, which gives the Secretariat the ability to alert the Security Council to things that they don't want to talk about. And Ban Ki-moon has never used that power. It's sort of, in UN circles, seen as a nuclear bomb, mistakenly. I just think he should be normalizing that. And because there are, you know, certain things because of the P5 that they just don't want to discuss. And the role of Zaid and Ban should be to force them to discuss it. They can't force a vote, but they can put it on the agenda. You know, the other big thing that Zaid has is the country presence. You know, they have a field presence around the world, and their, you know, the UN presence around the world tends to be dominated by UNDP, the development people, who always prioritize nice, cozy relationships with the government, because that's what you need in order to foster development projects. And you know, Ban Ki-moon has embraced this concept, he calls it human rights up front, which is to force the UN bureaucracy to prioritize human rights issues and to avoid the situation as occurred in Sri Lanka, was kind of most notoriously, where UNDP, under the guise of just, you know, kind of maintaining good relations with the Rajapaksa government and being physically there to be a witness, said nothing as 40,000 civilians were slaughtered in the waning months of the Tamil Tiger War. And it was that scandal that led Ban Ki-moon ultimately to adopt this human rights upfront thing. Zaid could be playing, you know, through his bureaucracy, a much more central role in kind of reorienting what a UN presence in the country means. And he should not allow UNDP to dominate that conversation.
Thank you. We have a woman right here, and when you're done, if you would, you had a question also. If when you're finished, if you could just pass the microphone to your right to the
Okay,
end.
thank you very much, Mr. Roth. Thank you for this eloquent analysis of Middle East. I could have not agreed with you more in everything. I'm Faye Mocktader, by the way. I'm an Atlantic Council member. The only question I have is, at this very critical point, if we have learned something from the Iraq conflict, is not to topple the regime without having an alternative to that regime. Otherwise, we'll create that vacuum which we are facing right now. Why should the priority be to topple Assad in Syria at this point? Our Air Force strike over ISIS cannot be successful without a very successful ground military operation on the ground. And the Syrian army is the only strong ground force in Syria. So why should we topple Assad and then create another vacuum at this point?
No,
Thank you.
My point is actually that nobody wants to create that vacuum. I mean, the lesson you draw from Iraq is the exact right lesson. And which is why what's being discussed for Syria is a managed transition. And you have to there, I think, distinguish between the government and the state. Nobody wants to destroy the state. They do want to change the government. They want to change, you know, the people, Assad and his entourage, that is controlling the state. They don't want to topple the state. And so the aim is to have a managed transition where you put a new government in place over that intact state. So you avoid the vacuum, you avoid the... Well, I mean, yes, that's what a negotiated solution would be. Can we get a negotiated solution? I don't know. It really depends to what extent will Russia strong-arm Assad into making some of the compromises that need to be made. Similarly, the FSA can't be absolutist. I mean, these are going to be difficult compromises. But if there's any hope for this to be agreed through a political solution rather than just burning itself out after years and years of slaughter, it will be something like that, keeping the state intact but changing the leadership.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Ilhan Kagri, and I work for the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And you said we could ask questions about Turkey, so I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity.
Sure.
So my question is actually twofold. One is the vast number of Syrian refugees in Turkey, aside from the camps, which everybody says are just wonderful by comparison, there's another 2.5 million, maybe more refugees. And Turkey doesn't seem to be able to have the infrastructure to support those. They don't allow schooling or jobs or whatever. So I'm wondering what you see in terms of what's going to happen to those Syrian refugees. And secondly, the war against the PKK is not really against the PKK. It seems to be against the Kurdish people, and the PKK is now swelling in the ranks because that's what happens to people that are attacked indiscriminately. So I'm wondering, it looks like the Europeans have given Turkey a free pass on a lot of human rights abuses, and I don't know how America's going to go along with this. But what do you see as the future of this kind of war against the PKK and American involvement or American response to these things?
Okay, well, I mean, first, on the refugee point, most refugees don't want to live in a camp. It's very regimented, it's confining. So the fact that Turkey has allowed refugees to just integrate is to be applauded. And the difficulty has been that there have been inadequate schooling opportunities, there have been restrictions on employment, and part of the deal behind the 6 billion euros that the European Union is offering Turkey is that these problems are addressed. Because the point is to enable Syrian refugees to make a life in Turkey. And a very significant percentage will want to stay close to home. They hope the war will be over with. They hope at some point they can go home. So if they can envision building a life in Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan, they'll stay there. They won't run off to Europe. But that requires serious investment. Now Turkey's obviously a moderately wealthy country, but even a country that's doing well economically, it's a big burden to have 4% of your population be Syrian refugees. So I'm all for the part of the European Union deal that involves spending a lot of money there. And they should do something comparable, certainly, in Lebanon and probably in Jordan as well if the Saudis don't give the Jordanians enough money. Just to kind of complete the thought there, the other thing that Europe has to do if it really wants to stop the boats, and the crisis in Europe has really not been one of capacity, it's a political crisis. The far right is gaining in Europe because Europe was seen to have lost control of its borders, because there was this flood of boats across the Aegean. Nobody knew when it would end. And this was just, fuel for the far right. So, the aim is to reduce the boats, but to do it in a lawful way, not in the current way. I mean, the current way is based on this fiction that Turkey is a safe third country, and therefore you can summarily send back the asylum seekers from Greece. You don't want to rely on that fiction. So the alternative is to voluntarily resettle people who have been screened as refugees in Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan. If they don't want to stay in those places, if they want to go to Europe, make enough slots so they can do that. And that's going to require serious numbers, but numbers that are not impossible. If Europe were to take in 500,000 a year, if the rest of the world would take in maybe 250,000 a year, and those are serious numbers, so that if you're sitting there in Turkey and you're deciding, am I going to risk my family's life on one of these rickety boats, or am I going to wait because it's not a forever wait? I mean, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. You're going to wait. And that enables Europe to take control of the borders in a lawful way. And even 1 million a year is 0.2% of Europe's population. I mean, it's not a capacity issue. So that's where we're trying to steer Europe. in terms of its approach to the refugees. With respect to, Erdogan, which we saw, Erdogan had the first half of his tenure was a gradual improvement. And he was aided there, on the one hand, by the slight possibility of EU accession. He, certainly had a self-interest in asserting control over the military. He, ultimately wanted to change the constitution for an executive presidency, so therefore wanted to bring the Kurds into the coalition. And all of these were sort of moderating factors. And so you did see a reduction in torture. You saw, the flourishing of civil society and the press. You saw, a reduction of discrimination against the Kurds. You just saw the subordination of the military. I mean, these were all positive things. It's all been downhill for the last 3 or 4 years. And there, there are various factors behind that. The Gezi Park protests were a big factor. The release of the audio tapes with Erdogan telling his son to hide the cash because the cops were coming. A big factor most recently was the rise of a moderate Kurdish party, which neither the PKK nor Erdogan wanted. Erdogan didn't want it because it prevented the AKP from getting a majority. The PKK didn't want it because they like to be the exclusive representatives of the Kurdish people. And so you had this sort of, almost a tacit agreement between the two extremes to resume the fighting as a way of polarizing Turkey, getting rid of this moderate Kurdish option. And it worked for Erdogan because he got his majority in the second election. And it worked for the PKK because suddenly they're where it's at for the Kurds. Nobody is looking out for the rights of the Turks or Kurds in this process. And this would be a natural place for the European Union, but they are held hostage by Erdogan in the refugee deal. So that does leave a special role for the US government, which isn't as bound there. I mean, the US is trying to use Incirlik Air Base, but the US is not nearly as beholden to Erdogan at this point as Merkel and the Europeans are. So I would like to see kind of a much more assertive approach there, which certainly the embassy in Ankara knows. But everybody treads cautiously with Erdogan these days.
We have a question straight in the back there.
Thank you, Rahim Rashidi with Kurdistan TV.
Yes.
Beside ISIS and economic crisis in Iraq, now there are more than 2 million refugees in Kurdistan. My question is, what is the role of international community and the Human Rights Watch to help Kurdistan? Thank you.
You're referring to refugees in which part of, in Iraqi Kurdistan?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I think a forgotten part of the crisis is that there are so many, technically internally displaced people, although I understand why Kurdistan calls them refugees. There are many people who have been displaced from their homes in Iraq and have fled to the relative safety of Iraqi Kurdistan. And at minimum, Iraqi Kurdistan deserves significant financial support to sustain that burden. And that's something I think is broadly recognized. The Kurdish forces themselves have been responsible for sectarian abuses. And it's important to address that. And this is not something the U.S. government goes out of its way to highlight because the Peshmerga are such a key element of the anti-ISIS strategy. They are the Northern Front. So, but regardless of the ultimate status of Iraqi Kurdistan, whether ultimately there's independence or whether it stays a part of a unified Iraq, it is important for there to be respect for rights, tolerance for ethnic and sectarian differences. And that is the priority of Human Rights Watch in its dealings with the authorities there.
Great. We have a question in the second row up here, right in the middle.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. My name is Rose Johanna. I'm a grad student at American University. I'm sure you're aware that Syria has its second cycle UPR coming up this year, and I'm curious as to your opinion about how helpful this review process is in the actual advancement of human rights, given how deeply embroiled this country is in conflict. Thank you.
Yeah. For those who don't know, I mean, UPR is UN lingo for the Universal Periodic Review, which is one of the innovations of the UN Human Rights Council. The old UN Human Rights Commission, the only way a government would come up before it would be if it got on the agenda, and it was a very politicized process. But under the Universal Periodic Review, as the name implies, everybody gets reviewed every 5 years. And so it just happens automatically. As a rule, the UPR is useful because it forces governments who ordinarily are not scrutinized to be scrutinized and to have to answer difficult questions in public. They often make commitments. They can then be held to those commitments. There's check back. And so overall, that's a useful process. Obviously, in the case of Syria, there's no lack of scrutiny. There's a commission of inquiry that's been operating for I don't know how many years now. So the one opportunity that the UPR would provide is it forces Syria to answer back. The commission of inquiry reports unilaterally, and that's the end of that. Assuming Syria shows up for the UPR, it has to answer questions. And that can be a useful process. I'd like that there will be a tendency to lie through its teeth, but if there's strong questioning on the part of the interlocutors during the Universal Periodic Review process, it can push Syria around why it doesn't allow independent access to the prisons. What's the justification for maintaining these sieges over civilian populations? What's the justification for barrel bombing and attacking hospitals and markets and schools and the civilian population in general? So, those are useful things to do. It also, I think, would help in the, as I was discussing, it would help in the process of highlighting Russia's responsibility for tolerating this and not using its leverage to change it.
Good. Yes, sir.
I'm Sernak Kifaklis from Voice of America Turkish Service. Mr. Roth, everybody criticizes the deal between Turkey and European Union about migrant crisis, but what is the best deal? What can be the best deal? What can be done to solve the migrant crisis?
Okay. I think that there are three things that I would highlight. One, which is stating the obvious, but you got to state it, is stop the atrocities in Syria that are driving so many to become refugees. So let's not forget that, but I realize that's not the heart of your question. Second, invest in making it possible for refugees who want to live in the countries of first refuge to make a life there. So that means more of the same with respect to the $6 billion promised to Turkey, but similar serious investments in Lebanon and Jordan. And then third, generous refugee resettlement, so that those people who are, they've been screened, they're found not to be ISIS, they're found not to be economic migrants. These are people genuinely fleeing persecution. They are refugees. Those found to have been refugees and who still want to go someplace else, someplace to the west. You need a generous resettlement program to receive those people, so that way they won't hop on the boat. And as we're conversing with key European leaders, they seem to be talking about serious numbers in that respect. Justin Trudeau was talking about serious numbers. The US isn't talking about serious numbers. The US is not doing its part. And even though, frankly, maintaining the integrity of the European Union, preventing the rise of the far right in the European Union should be a US national security interest. And that's an interest that would be advanced by a more generous resettlement program. The discourse here is being dominated by these fictitious fears of ISIS infiltrators joining the refugees, even though if you were an ISIS infiltrator, the last thing you would do to get into the United States would be to come as a refugee, being screened multiple times over 2 years, rather than just picking up a tourist visa or a student visa or a business visa. So the discourse in this country, dominated by the far right, is wacko on this issue, and it is undermining US national security because the US is not doing its part to help the European Union create a serious resettlement program that would sap the incentive to get on one of these rickety boats, enable Europe to demonstrate that it has regained control of its border, and therefore undermine the rise of the far right in Europe.
We got time for one more quick one. Yes, sir.
And Antoine van Akma, I'm curious, to what extent do you think that the kind of weakening of the push for human rights, at least as I perceive it, has been influenced by what you could say the failure of the Arab Spring, and the fact that at the end we saw rise of authoritarian regimes, Sisi in Egypt, and other basically backsliding and in fact handing over to extremely extreme forces.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the idea that if you just kind of have a mass movement in the street, that's going to, produce lasting change, that's not sufficient, and that's one thing that, has become quite apparent. I actually think that, today, one of the things I've become very concerned about is that many autocrats have been terrified of what they saw with the Arab Spring. And even though, the revolutions have been reversed in all cases but Tunisia, nonetheless, if you're an autocrat, the last thing you want is a bunch of people in the street protesting against you. And what they saw with the Arab Spring is that traditional civil society, had some mobilization capacity through the traditional media, but the Arab Spring illustrated the greatly magnified mobilization capacity of civil society using social media. And this was a new development, and it was terrifying. It was illustrated by the Arab Spring. It was the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. It was the Occupy Central Revolution in Hong Kong. And this has led autocrat after autocrat to try to nip that in the bud and prevent that from ever happening in their country. So we've seen a real global crackdown on civil society of a form that I have not seen in the last couple of decades. And that's sort of the negative lesson of the Arab Spring that I'm worried about. The guise often used by these autocrats is to say, oh, these civil society organizations are getting foreign funding, that's interference in our domestic affairs. So the same leaders who are actively soliciting foreign investment, foreign trade deals, foreign contributions to their humanitarian or development programs are suddenly treating it as interference in their internal affairs to have foreign funding to an NGO that might hold the government to account. The West needs to be standing up much more vigorously against that hypocrisy and for the right of people to band together, because frankly, that coupled with a free press are the ways you hold governments to account. And if we don't stand up against this backlash, we are going to have an increasingly authoritarian, unaccountable set of leaders around the world.
I think that's a good point to end. I'll just say for the record, Ken, that personally speaking, my ability to win arguments in the country and in Crumville, New York, is in direct proportion to my ability to buy the beer. So this in the end may be the secret. Thank you so much for your gift of time. Please join me in thanking Ken.